welcome back to the channel. My name's Rebecca, I'm 45 years old and I used to suffer from multiple sclerosis, but I no longer experience any of the symptoms since starting the carnivore diet 2 years ago. Today's video has been inspired by the fact that last week I went for my appointment to renew my residency in Spain. So I have lived in Spain for the past 5 years with a temporary residency card, which I got under the Brexit withdrawal agreement. So I moved here just before the Brexit deadline so that I could get residency under the withdrawal agreement, and that gave me 5 years temporary residency. And now I'm at the point where I get to apply for permanent residency, which I have the automatic right to under the Brexit withdrawal agreement. And in another 5 years' time, I can apply for Spanish citizenship. So this is a really big deal. It's like a milestone that I have lived here for 5 years, and it's given me cause to reflect over the past 5 years and think about how my move to Spain has been part of my healing journey. And my healing journey, if you've been following my channel, has been really quite astonishing, because before I moved to Spain, I was using a wheelchair. I was basically housebound and I was extremely sick. I spent much of the day on the sofa and I was nauseous and I had aches and pains and terrible cognitive issues, brain fog, memory loss, bladder issues, balance issues, you name it, a whole load of symptoms that were preventing me from living my life as somebody with multiple sclerosis. And the prognosis was that this was only going to get worse. And here I am now, living a completely independent life in a foreign country, and I don't have any of the symptoms, and my last brain scan was completely clear of new lesions. It's nothing short of miraculous. And obviously, as my whole channel is about the carnivore diet, so obviously the carnivore diet has been the thing that's given me the biggest change. But there was a process before that where I did actually recover to some extent. I was no longer using a wheelchair by the time I started the carnivore diet. And my move to Spain has been the reason for that. And I wanted to reflect on that because it's also been a huge challenge. The past 5 years have been very, very difficult. It's been highs and lows and good things and challenges that I've just had a lot to process when I look back over the past 5 years. So I thought what I'd do is look at certain aspects of my time in Spain and talk about the positive sides and the challenges that I faced, all of which have been part of my healing journey and part of me rebuilding my life after multiple sclerosis basically destroyed it, and I've had to start from scratch and rebuild. So the first category is environment, and this was probably the main reason. There were two main reasons that I moved to Spain, and they were environment and language, but I'll come to language later. But environment, this was the most pressing issue because I came to realize that I could no longer live in the city. When I was at my most sick, I was living in Birmingham, which is my hometown in the UK. It's the second biggest city in England, and it was my home environment, so I felt very comfortable there. But suddenly, on a physiological level, I couldn't stay there, and there were many reasons for that. And one of them was that I discovered, and this is quite controversial and you may or may not believe me, but I discovered that I had become sensitive to Wi-Fi radiation and mobile phones or cell phones. Like I say, that's controversial, not everybody believes me, but when you have MS, you become sensitive to your environment to a degree that is really quite exaggerated. It's much harder to withstand environmental stresses, things like life stress or heat is another one. Lights, I wasn't able to look at lights, and I discovered that among those stressors was Wi-Fi radiation, and that's when I realized that I couldn't stay in the city and I had to move to the countryside. And if I was going to move to the countryside, I wanted to move to a warmer place because England's not very nice for living off-grid. And off-grid there was also a financial element because I was not working and I didn't know if I'd ever be able to return to work. And the UK is very expensive, so I was just living at home every day using the heating because it's a cold country. and not earning enough money to be able to pay for the heating, and the government refused me welfare. Basically, everything conspired to make me realise that what I felt was my only option was to move up a mountain in Spain, where it was sunnier, where I could live off grid and where I could be in a better environment, close to nature, and I would give myself the best chance of healing. So that is what I did. And I had to do it immediately because of Brexit. That gave me a deadline after which I wouldn't be able to move to Spain and have the automatic right to live and work there. So I did that. I moved heaven and earth in order to change my environment and to be somewhere where I thought that I would be able to get the best chance of healing. And that's exactly what happened. So I spent 4 years actually on the mountain. I no longer live on the mountain, which I'm very sad about, but life moves on. So those 4 years on the mountain have been extremely healing, but it didn't come without its challenges. So the healing aspects of the mountain were obviously the sunshine, the vitamin D. When you have MS, you tend to have low vitamin D, and I did. Tends to be more prevalent in northern latitudes, and you know, there are lots of studies that show that people with MS have low vitamin D, and I certainly had a deficiency. So that was great, being, you know, out in the sunshine. Lots of grounding. I was out barefoot on the mountain, getting lots of grounding work going, and the obviously being surrounded by spectacular views and nature, fresh air, spring water, all of these things, and also getting my stamina back because I'd been basically sofa bound for a couple of years, and I was actually more isolated when I was living in Birmingham because of that than I was on the mountain. So I spent a couple of years gradually building my strength back and my stamina back by walking my dogs up the mountain slopes, and that was a long, slow process, but it was obviously very beneficial to my physical health. So being in that mountain environment kind of laid the ground for me then to fully get my health back. It didn't get me fully there. I still had a lot of restrictions, and I felt those restrictions quite strongly because it was a steep learning curve moving off grid and learning an off-grid way of life, which is very physically demanding. So what energy I did manage to get back was immediately gone on all the extra physical activities I had to do, like collecting firewood or kindling. Just driving up and down the mountain was quite tiring because I had to use a 4x4, and my 4x4 was always breaking down, and it was just a very rattly, steep journey, and sometimes you wouldn't be able to drive because there'd be like a tree trunk falling in your path, or you'd have to chase away cows or whatever it might be. Everything was just that little bit more complicated and a bit more of an effort, and it was a lot of brain work as well, because my water pump would break, or my solar panels suddenly wouldn't work, or I couldn't use my fridge in the winter, and I had to figure out how to keep build a cold store, and just lots of things that I came up against living in this new environment that I'd never had to because of living in the convenience of a city most of my life. I actually did grow up in the countryside in England, but it wasn't anything like the deep countryside I was now living in, a completely different way of life. So there was the challenge of the environment, and obviously it wasn't always sunny. I mean, northern Spain has seasons, it has 4 seasons, and in the winter it was extremely difficult because I had beautiful sea views, but that meant I was exposed to the North Sea wind, the Cantabrian Sea, which was to the north, and that the wind that came from the Cantabrian Sea was cold and strong, and sometimes there'd be a storm and it would be like horizontal rain, and it was always muddy, and I have dogs, and the dogs would just trample mud through the cabin, and the winter was difficult. The winter was challenging up the mountain. It had its nice side, you'd put the fire on and you've got the firewood and you'd be cozy and warm around the fire. Oh, and the solar panels in the winter, you didn't have the same hours of light, so you didn't necessarily have all of the conveniences that you would have if you were living on grid. So it was a learning curve, but it was also, I also liked it. I liked it very much because I felt like I was, living in the city has its own problems, and the life I used to live in the city brought its problems, and I felt like I just swapped one set of problems for another, but that the problems I was facing on the mountain, I could accept more easily because they were very kind of deeply human problems, kind of the problems that our ancestors might have faced. And they felt more deeply real and natural and human. And there was something invigorating about that. So it wasn't that it was problem-free by any means, but I felt like the types of problems I faced because of my environment, I could accept more and did me more good in terms of the new things I was learning and the strengths that I was gaining. So yeah, environment's been a big part of it in many, many different ways. And I would encourage anybody to move to a place like this and try a new way of life for a healing journey, because it definitely, got me like 50% there. Diet's the next thing. So environment and now diet. So diet, I discovered the carnivore diet when I was in Spain. I discovered it online, so I could have discovered it while still living in England, I suppose, in theory. But I think being in Spain did come into the picture for me in terms of diet. When I first moved to Spain, I was following the OMS diet, Overcoming Multiple Sclerosis. And that was a kind of near vegan diet, although it did include fish. But it ruled out all saturated fat, which I now think is quite ironic. But yeah, so you couldn't just have like a vegan burger. So it was more strict than veganism in some ways, but it did include fish. But anyway, I was happy following that diet in England. It didn't bring my health back, but I did enjoy that diet. I suppose it was an improvement on not following any diet. It was easier to get hold of the kind of ingredients that I wanted on that diet while living in the UK, because the UK has a lot of variety. It imports everything, and you can get any type of food, any type of spice, any type of herbs, whatever, you can get whatever you want in the UK in the supermarkets. But here in Spain, it's not actually that varied. You can't get as many ingredients, and there's less variety in terms of types of cuisine that is available, certainly in a rural environment. I'm in Asturias, which is a rural environment. So in Madrid, you can probably get all these things, but where I live, you can't really. So it just became harder to follow that diet. So I just stopped following it, and I kind of fell back into convenience food and carbohydrate heavy. So for a while, diet was a challenge, and it was not helping my health. I started to get quite bloated, and I remember having like recurring skin issues, and I just felt very tired and run down a lot of the time. And I now realise that was because of my diet, because when I went carnivore, everything changed. And that was while I was on the mountain, and it was, within a month, suddenly I got my core strength back, and my energy and my fatigue lifted, and my memory was back, and it was absolutely astonishing. But I've talked about this a lot on my channel, so I won't go into much detail. But I think one of the reasons why I was encouraged to start the diet was because I was in Spain, and particularly northern Spain, Asturias, because it's a farming region. It's very meat friendly, and the quality of the beef is excellent. That it's mainly beef. Well, pork as well, because Spain's a very pork loving country. Pork's not my favorite meat. Actually, I kind of try to avoid it. But beef here is amazing, and it's all over the place, and you can get, grass-fed, organically raised beef, no problem. Lamb is a little bit harder to come by. Apparently different areas of Spain have more lamb, but here it's more beef. But anyway, I realised when I first came across the carnivore diet that it seemed like something intriguing, and eventually I decided to give it a go. And it was partly the fact that the food available here is very meat heavy, and I thought, well, that's actually not going to be a problem. So it did encourage me to take that step. It was part of the reason I took that step. So obviously that has been a huge part of my healing journey. So environment and diet have been key components of me recovering my health. But there's been more to my healing journey than just my physical health. I also have had to rebuild my life since everything kind of collapsed after I got sick. And I lost my career, I lost my social group, my language skills were starting to die, and I'm a translator, so that really mattered. I speak French and Spanish. My Spanish is better than my French, but both of those languages were my bread and butter, and I was worried that I would lose those. So language was a big reason why I decided to move to Spain when I did. I was not very well when I moved to Spain. It was hard for me to move countries, but my thinking was that I would maybe be able to resurrect my career as a translator, although I wasn't accounting for AI, but that's another issue. Translation's dead. Anyway, that's what my thoughts were, that if I moved to Spain, then I'd be able to stop my Spanish from dying and maybe be able to work again in the future. So that was a big reason why I moved. And that's been part of the healing process, because it's been so important to me as part of my identity as a translator, as a linguist. And I found it very, very hard to accept that I would just waste away on the sofa in Birmingham and lose all my skills. So that's actually been a really big part of my healing journey, moving here and fighting for my Spanish. And it was a fight. This is where it was a challenge, because when I first moved out here, I realized that my Spanish had already started to die and it was not as good as it had previously been. And I felt that really strongly, and that affected my confidence and my ability to integrate, because I felt very self-conscious about my accent, holding myself to a higher standard than I could actually meet. And my memory was terrible, and I just really felt that, the difference, and was very, very, painfully aware of the difference. Added to that is the fact that I've learnt Spanish in Mexico, and Spain Spanish is much different and actually quite hard, because Spanish people tend to speak very fast compared to Mexicans. And there's different vocabulary, different grammar structures. And for a while, I felt a little bit insecure about my language skills. But also, there's another dialect here in Asturias called Bable, which there's lots of different dialects across Spain, and the one in Asturias is Bable. And I just didn't know what people were saying to me when they were talking in Bable. It's a very different accent, different words. I'll give you an example. So gallinero, which means chicken coop, would be gallineru, or vamos de paseo, to walk the dogs. I'll go for a walk. Paseo is paseu, so the O sound is an U. And other things like ye lo que hay. That's a phrase you'll hear quite a lot. Ye lo que hay, and that means it is what it is. But ye is in normal Spanish, in Castilian Spanish. Es lo que hay becomes ye lo que hay. So, differences like that, and there's lots of them, but I'm starting to get used to them now. But Bable, it is actually technically Spanish, but it just sounds completely different. Also, it's like the vocab pool that I was working with was now completely different, because it's like farming vocabulary, off-grid vocabulary, stuff that I hadn't really come across before. And I found the language side of things at the beginning very, very challenging. But now, 5 years down the line, actually, I'm quite proud of myself, because I do think that I've recovered the level that I used to have, and have also probably improved in some areas as well. Like my farming vocabulary is quite good now. Just a few days ago, I was up a mountain with a friend, and we were talking to this other guy who I didn't know, but my friend knew. And we were talking about the mountain life, and I was quite in my element. I was able to have this conversation and not sound like an idiot. And it just struck me that I know I've come a long way. My Spanish has come a long way since I've been here, and people don't look at me anymore with that, oh, you're just a foreigner. Like, actually, people sometimes ask me if I'm Spanish. How about that? That's such a compliment, because I don't look remotely Spanish. So language has ultimately, over the course of the past 5 years, been part of my healing journey, because I found a lot of validation. And not just that, but speaking another language is really good for your cognitive health. It keeps your brain alive. It's a really good mental exercise. So yeah, I'm really happy with the language side of things, and I would encourage anybody, if you're moving to Spain, don't let language be a barrier. Don't let language put you off. I find that Spanish people are very happy to be patient and tolerant as you try to speak, as long as you do make that effort to speak. And also, there's lots of things like Duolingo and Google Translate. So there's no reason why you shouldn't, at the very beginning, if you don't speak Spanish at all, be able to get by and just, pick up a few phrases to get by. So I think language has been a really good ultimately has been a really positive part of my healing journey. So the other aspects, I would say community has been a really big deal for me. That's been challenging it has actually been like an anti-healing element in some ways. I talked about this in previous videos. It's been a very, very challenging aspect of my time in Spain. And actually that wasn't because of the Spanish community. That was because I ended up meeting the British expat community before I was able to integrate and meet Spanish people. And I think a large reason for that was that it was the pandemic when I moved here. When I got here, like 2 weeks later, it was lockdown, and Spain had a very strict lockdown. So obviously that was to do with circumstances, not to do with Spain itself. And I didn't get a fair impression of Spanish community because everything was closed and there was no one around to meet. And so it just so happened that my only neighbour on the mountain, a Danish lady, knew all the British expats, and she had all these gatherings after the pandemic ended, and I met all the British expats that I wouldn't have met if it wasn't for that. And that was a very toxic community, very gossipy, interfering to the point of harassment, and I don't even want to go into it, but it didn't help me with my integration, and it also didn't help me with my mental health. So that was a mistake on my part. When I lived in Mexico, I avoided expats, not because I didn't like them, but because I wanted to practice my Spanish, and I should have done the same here, but I didn't, and I live to regret it. But now I've moved to a new area and I have a lovely little community around me. It's taken me a while. Maybe it's my age as well. It's harder to meet new people. When I moved to Mexico, I was in my early 20s, and everybody was hanging around, socializing, going out dancing, partying. It's easy to meet people when you're at that age. But now, I moved here when I was in my late 30s, and it's harder to make new friends with people of a similar age because they've got their families, they've got their jobs, they've got their friends already. That was part of the picture as well. It was the pandemic, it was the fact that I had MS and I was more restricted and I was up a mountain, and just being older and being a different stage of life. It's taken me a longer time to integrate and to find that community, but now I feel very welcome. I actually have a little bit of a support network. When I was injured for the past 6 months, my foot and my leg were injured. They're healed now, but during that 6 months I realized that I did have people around. People would check in on me, and I feel like I've become part of the local community and I feel welcome here. And of course that's a huge part of a healing journey, to feel that you have people around you and friends and neighbours that are there for you. I think it's very hard to be in isolation and to heal. So I had my time on the mountain in isolation, and then I had my time of venturing back out into the world and making all the mistakes and relearning boundaries and being discerning about who I spent my time with. And I've been through all of that, and 5 years down the line I do feel much happier in terms of community, and that makes my heart and soul much happier. Just yesterday I went to this lovely yoga gathering with my friend Yannicka. There's 8 or 10 of us, and it was yoga combined with voice work through the theme of chakras. So it was hard to explain, but it was singing and yoga and opening our chakras. So it was beautiful, and it was in the forest on this beautiful platform, and it was 4 hours long, and being there just felt very comfortable, very much this is the kind of community that I'm looking for, and I found it, and I'm here, and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. So that's just wonderful experiences and people that I'm meeting. And yeah, so I could talk about community all day because I think it's kind of been the theme of this year. And then culture, that's another thing I wanted to talk about. So this is the final thing I wanted to talk about. So culturally, I have found Spain to be actually more different than I would have anticipated to England, even more so than Mexico was. But as I say, I think that's partly because I moved to Mexico when I was in my early 20s. So there were lots of sort of cultural bridges with people of my own age, like music or just cultural things that, particularly music actually. Whereas in Spain, I found it more culturally alien. I can't really explain why. Not in a bad way necessarily, but just in a way that I've taken time to adapt to. I didn't feel at the beginning that I really understood Spanish people, again, it was the pandemic, I was isolated on a mountain, I was ill, you know, all of these things came into that. Now I don't feel that quite so strongly, and I love Spanish people, I think they're absolutely great. So I think culturally, things about Spain that I've found challenging have been, for example, things like the opening hours. That might sound stupid, but Spain's got like weird opening hours. Compared to the UK, it's really different, and I think it's because it's a hot country, and down in the south it makes more sense because they have a siesta during the hottest time of the day. But it basically means there's a 3-hour lunch break during which everything closes down, and I just can't get used to it. Like it's not really necessary up in the north because it's not hot enough to have a siesta, but it's still the same opening hours. So 2 till 5 everything closes except supermarkets, which is something. But that's like the time of day when I'm at my most productive and wanting to get stuff done and out and about, and everything's closed. And it's just, I just can't get used to it. And then they open again at like 5 till 8, so which is much later than the UK, which that's whatever, it's just different. And I just, after 5 years, I still haven't got used to the opening hours. Also, you'll go to a town and randomly everything will be shut that day, and you don't know why, and you ask somebody, why is everything closed today? And they'll be like, oh, because hoy es festivo, like today is a holiday. And you'll be like, oh, so where's the fiesta? No, there's no fiesta, everyone's just home. And it's just this town. It's just this town, and it's having a day today. Hoy es festivo. It's like, how many today? And you're like, how does everyone know? Like, everyone knows this town's closed today, that town's closed next week, this whatever, and or this, the entire of Asturias is closed today, or the entire country is closed today. And I do not know how everybody knows, keeps on top of it. But it's like either it's a small town, or it's the whole region, or it's the entire country. They'll just have these festivo days where everything's closed. And I don't. Anyway, so the opening hours I find quite challenging about Spain. Also, bureaucracy. Now, Spanish people will tell you the same. So it's not even funny. It's a dystopian nightmare in Spain. Bureaucracy is something really, really difficult. And when I first arrived here, I found that really hard because I had cognitive issues and exhaustion, and it was the pandemic, and it was Brexit, and Brexit meant that there was all these extra bureaucratic issues, and nobody knew what the procedures were because it was unprecedented, so everyone was annoyed about it, and there were backlogs, and moving country is just such a huge undertaking. You know, you've got to change your driving license, import your car, get your residency, get a new neurologist, and I was buying a property, it was like lawyers, notaries, you know, it was just utterly overwhelming. And I have to say, I'm still not quite there yet when it comes to Spanish bureaucracy. None of it makes sense to me. I'm autonomo, which means freelance, and I have to pay €350 a month to be freelance and do like 6 tax returns a year, like the quarterly ones, the annual one, the VAT return, something called IRPF that I don't even understand, and like pay somebody to help me do the tax returns, as well as paying €350 a month to be freelance, because I can't get private health insurance because my MS diagnosis means it's too expensive, so this is a cheaper option. Even Spanish people hate the freelance system. They call it tontonomo. Tonto is stupid. Autonomo, tontonomo. You have to be stupid to be an autonomo, basically. And so don't ask me why it's like this in Spain. It just doesn't make any sense, and it's the bane of my life. I feel stressed just talking about it. So yeah, Spanish bureaucracy is something about the culture that I find really hard, and Spanish people find it hard as well, and they will basically like bend the rules to try and avoid all of the bureaucracy because it's ridiculous. I think that's the one aspect of Spanish culture that I would say that I actively dislike. And I mention it in terms of a healing journey because when you have stress with MS, you get worse. You know, it really affects your mental, physical state. So it's been something that has held me back during my healing journey. But at the same time, there's aspects of Spanish culture that I really love and that have helped me. You know, it's a happy culture. It's an outdoor culture. It's a sunny culture. And being in that type of culture has lifted my spirits during some very difficult times. So I'm very grateful for Spanish culture. The music, like I love flamenco, for example. I love the dance and I love the actual music. So stuff like that, which I really appreciate. There's a whole lot about Spanish culture that is very, very interesting and very, very beautiful. And being in a new culture is something that constantly inspires me and just keeps my spirits alive, you know, and my sense of discovery and adventure alive. So I just went down south for a couple of weeks over the past few weeks, and that being in a whole different area with its own sort of mini subcultures was super interesting. And you know, the whole like Moorish influence, Islamic architecture and stuff like that. I love Spain for its culture. So you know, there's been challenges and then there's been really wonderful things about it. So yeah. Okay, so that's basically my little tribute to Spain, where I've lived for the past 5 years and where I intend to continue to live for the next 5 years and beyond. It's been an absolutely huge part of my healing journey, and I really feel like that decision to move to Spain before Brexit, before such a thing became impossible, was the absolute best thing I could have possibly done. So there you go, that's my video, and I hope you guys are doing great wherever you are. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye.